Hello everyone and welcome to Sinful Gaming. I hope you're all doing well, I hope you're all staying safe, and most of all, I hope you're all fighting that war against the Grey. Today's video, we're going to be talking about the pros and cons of starting with various armies in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, in particular the Chaos Grand Alliance armies from the game. We did a video not too long ago talking about the best and worst armies in Warhammer Age of Sigmar to get started with, and people were asking us to do all the different armies and give our opinions using the same criteria for all the different armies. And so today, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at all the different Chaos armies and give you our opinions on which ones are the best and which ones are the worst armies to start with in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Now, we won't be ranking them best and worst like the previous video. Instead, we'll be talking about each using the same criteria and talking about why these armies either are or are not good for starting with Warhammer Age of Sigmar. So without further ado, let's get cracking on into the list, and before we do that though, let's get checking out the criteria just to give everyone a reminder of what we're doing. And so, going over that criteria again, for starters, an army we view is good to start with in Warhammer Age of Sigmar follows at least a few of these, and those that maybe are a little bit harder will not follow quite as many. There's definitely no bad army, because the old adage of you should always go with the models you like. However, it is worth noting when your army has maybe some negatives to getting started with, so that you know about these in the future. For starters, a start collecting box or similar easy point of entry like a starter box or jewel box or battle force box if they're out around that time of year is a fantastic way to get started with your army. Battle Force boxes that come out around Christmas and jewel boxes that come out at various times through the year on release are great ways to get into armies but aren't always available, so this can depend, and change depending on when those boxes are out. However, start collecting boxes, or as the new Vanguard boxes are happening, they're going to be main parts of the range, so as they are available for various armies, we'll mention them and we'll talk about how they can be used. Model count is also really important to an army, and this sort of connects with the next 2 points. First of all, the cost of the army, and then the lack of summoning. So model count can be really important when you're starting with an army, because a model count army that is really high is obviously going to have painting issues as well as cost, and it's going to require more models to be bought to play that army properly on the tabletop. Having a low model count army really does ease the painting thing, and even if they're more detailed miniatures, it really does make them more easy to paint, because you're having to spend less time on those models. Cost of the army obviously changes depending on the amount of models you're playing, though some models are more expensive just based on they are a lower model count army. So cost is definitely something, because you want to have an army that's not going to cost you the most out of any army to get started on the tabletop. Lack of summoning is definitely a bonus for any army when you're starting. If you have summoning, this does raise the cost of your army, and some armies have varying different levels of summoning. Some summon like 1 or 2 units a game, or some will summon almost an entirely brand new army to the tabletop. Painting skills, as we mentioned, like quantity can definitely be an issue in itself with painting, but also the detail of the miniatures. How much detail do these miniatures have? If you pick the most highly detailed miniatures to start with for your first army, you're going to have a lot more painting skills that you need to pick up to really get that army painted on the tabletop quicker. And then obviously if something's got a lot of, very easy to paint things, it's going to go to the tabletop really quicker, and you're going to expand and explore your collection more and have more painted models more quickly. We're also looking for armies to have multiple ways to play as well, because this is really important. If an army's got multiple ways to play, it means you can play with either the same miniatures in different ways, choosing different sub-factions, or it's meaning that you have a wide range of miniatures that you can change your army without actually having to change your core allegiance. So you can play, this particular army and then play it in various different ways with various different models from that army being used. Ease of play is also another massive one. You don't want a hyper complicated army with a ton of special rules on top of it to have to be your first army, although it's not always an issue. You may just have a little bit bigger of a learning curve than some other people, but ease of play definitely is something we suggest when looking at your first army. And last but not least, of course, is competitiveness. While I guess competitiveness can chop and change all the time, it's important to remember that maybe some armies aren't as strong as others, and this is a common thing throughout the game. It's just important to know if you're picking up a low tier army, something that's not doing really well competitively, and all your friends have really competitive armies, you may struggle to win the games. And while might not be a bad thing, if you really love the models, you're not going to care. But there is the issue here of knowing that's going to be a struggle, and winning every game, every win means that much more to you. Or maybe this army isn't for you because you want to be winning more games. So with that said, out of the way, let's get cracking on and look through the armies. And so we start off the video with Beasts of Chaos. So the first thing with Beasts of Chaos is they do have access to a star collecting box. However, you don't get an awful lot of points in that star collecting box, and the monster in there maybe isn't the build of the list you're wanting to go down all that much. Well, you could definitely buy 2 or 3 and sometimes even 4 of the box set. You do sort of start to double up on that shaman. You definitely don't need 3 or 4 shamans in an army. So 1 or 2 of that box is a great way to start your force and put you on the pathway to a good 1,000-point army straight off the gate. Definitely a good investment, and this does help Beasts of Chaos. However, from there, model count for the army can be quite high. This generally is a Horde army, though there are some builds in the army, like playing either full Warherd, the Minotaurs, or full Thunderscorn, the Dragon Ogres, will definitely lower the amount of models required in your army, but playing anything with Brayherd, especially using the models from the Star Collecting Box, you're going to require a lot more models in the army. This isn't as big an issue though as some other armies with higher model count, as Beasts of Chaos generally are a little bit older kits. They still look fine in all honesty, but this does mean they are generally a little bit cheaper than other similar sized kits in the Games Workshop range. This means you can pick up an army of similar size to other Horde armies for a little bit cheaper, which is always nice. However, the amount of summoning that Beasts of Chaos do, they have a very large amount of summoning within their army, definitely does raise that cost back up. So while your initial purchase for your initial army might be cheaper buying some star collecting boxes and getting cheaper than average units, your ability to summon is really going to be dependent on how much you can spend to get more summoning options, because you're going to want different options for the army. Painting skills are an interesting one with Beasts of Chaos, because while they do have a myriad of different things, they do go together relatively well. Zangor are definitely the exception to this, with those models being really highly detailed, but the average Beast of Chaos miniatures like Gors, Bestigors, and even Dragon Ogres and most of your monsters go together really simple, as they've got nice large patches of skin, some really basic sort of painting with contrast, and large amounts of fur as well, where dry brushing is your best friend. So some really nice basic painting techniques will get you through a lot of these models really quickly. The army does have multiple ways to play, and as we mentioned, you can play more elite armies with all Thunderscorn or all Warherd style armies, but you can also build into an all Tzeentch army running nothing but Zangor. You can also run an army that's more monster heavy, and you can also play around with different sub-factions that like to mix in various different units. Things like the Darkwalkers are really interesting in that they allow you to use your outflanking rules with units otherwise not allowed, like Thunderscorn and the Warherd, which is really fun. Ease of play with Beasts of Chaos is an issue though, as the army doesn't play the game like many other armies. It really relies on board control and having loads of chaff to throw at your opponent, meanwhile capturing the points. So it doesn't really play the all go in and fight combat a lot sort of style of play with many other armies. So it does have a little bit of a higher flaw with learning how to play this army to really make it work. And of course, this leads to competitive issues. The army does struggle competitively. While really skilled players can definitely do really well with the army, it does struggle at that point. With not many of the basic sort of things in the game working too well for the army, it does struggle in straight up fights against many of the armies in the game. So competitiveness is definitely an issue. Though the hope is you maybe, if your army's not competitive now, it will be sometime in the future. Next, we have Blades of Khorne. So, first of all, Blades of Khorne do have a couple of star collecting boxes, which is really fun. They've got both a demon and a mortal style of star collecting box, and the mortal one is really important as it contains some miniatures you can't get other places. So, if you're wanting to have a Bloodsecrator, Korgorath, or Bloodstoker within your force, you're definitely going to want to pick up the star collecting box for the mortal half of the Blades of Khorne. The demon box also comes with some really cool options, things like Bloodletters and your Blood Crushers, and of course your cool Skull Cannons as well for some nice shooting. So with the 2 available star collecting boxes, you can definitely build a very fun Blades of Khorne list using the different units you will receive in different boxes. Now, this does also work really well because, of course, these lower the model count, and generally, depending on what style of army you're playing with Blades of Khorne, your model count can vary from rather elite to more middling-sized hordes. You're never going to have a massive horde army with Blades of Khorne, but you are definitely going to have some more, I guess, infantry-heavy army styles if you want to go down that way. We can hit that 100 model mark if you really want to, but most Blades of Khorne armies will probably throw around that 60 model or even lower if they're running an all Bloodthirster list. If you're running the heavy Bloodthirster list, this of course drops your models down, but all the army is going to be, I guess, issued with the fact that it does require summoning. This, like the Beasts of Chaos, requires you to have different units to summon at different points in time, though Blades of Khorne summoning is nowhere near as plentiful as some other armies, so you're not having to worry about summoning a whole army to the table like some other armies do, but instead units here and there. Painting skills for Blades of Khorne are relatively easy. A lot of their warriors have large flat armor surfaces which take colour really well, and other units have large patches of skin which take contrast really well. So painting for this army can be really simple. There are some details on there like the trim on a lot of the armor panels that require a little bit of fine brush skill, but this is really easy to sort of learn, especially when the armor is all, raised areas. When it's raised areas, you can really find using some techniques with your brush to really find those trims really easily. The army does have a couple of ways to play, though the most competitive way, and probably the only competitive way at the moment, is generally running their Bloodthirster heavy list, but you do have the other options to run more Horde heavy if you so wish. Ease of play is certainly an issue with Khorne, as it does require a lot of Holy Within bubbles and requires you to really be measuring a lot during the game, so this can be a little bit of an issue. The army doesn't really play an awful lot like you think it would with all these bubbles that require from a bunch of your troops to be in range of certain things. It means you're having to sort of measure and do all this, where it really is an army you think would just charge forward and murder things. Competitiveness, Blades of Khorne are probably down the bottom of the middle, though with some lists and the fact that some of their monsters can just go turbo all of a sudden, things like Scarbrand and the Bloodthirsters, you can do really well with the army just through sheer weight of power. Next, we have the Disciples of Tzeentch. So for starters, they do have a star collecting box which features a lot of the demon units and a lot of the units you're wanting to do. However, there is an issue with this star collecting box in that you need to buy extra horrors to really get the most out of that unit. Yes, you can run pink horrors without having them split because you do get options of different rules for them, but really you're wanting that split and split again rule, so you're having to buy an extra 2 boxes of blue and brimstone horrors on top of this box to get the best out of it. Model count for the army can be an issue because of this. You are required to have quite a large amount of models if you're running any form of the army. Even the more model heavy style of the army requires a decent amount of Arcanauts, which are highly detailed miniatures, so that comes into its own problem. Cost of the army, of course, due to this, just rises exponentially. This can be a really expensive army to buy, needing all the different summoning options and also the splitting options for your horrors can be a really expensive purchase. Even if you are running a more mortal army, your summoning then does come from summoning demons, so you're requiring to buy more and more demons, and generally with horrors, that can be quite costly, as you're having to buy a box of pinks and then 2 boxes of blues and brims for every box of pinks you buy in order to get the most out of those units. Painting skills, though, for different parts of the army is different, very different. So the demon half of the army comes together really nicely with large flat areas that take weird colours really well. The demons go together really simple with contrast and other basic painting techniques. However, the mortal side of the army is extremely detailed, and while they are absolutely beautiful miniatures, you definitely have to take your time and you'll learn a lot of different techniques. You've got metal, you've got trim, you've got feathers, you've got fur, all of it mixed into the same models, which really does make an interesting painting time, but it can be quite a long process as well. Multiple ways to play the army, it definitely does have, the mortal army is a lot better than a lot of people think, and the demon army is definitely one of the stronger versions of armies in the entirety of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. So you definitely do have different ways to play, and within your demon armies you can play in various different ways, either running heavy flamer to shoot your opponent off the board, or horror clogging up the board, just spamming so many troops across the board that split and split again. Ease of play is an issue with the army regardless of what version you play, as the army is magic heavy, so it requires you to remember a lot of different spells. Definitely print out some magic cards or go on AOS reminders and check out some cheat sheets on there to really help you master this army, as it does have quite a lot to remember, especially with a weird army allegiance mechanic. Things like the agendas and with your fate points do require some extra knowledge and some extra planning and things to remember during the game. Competitiveness, as we mentioned, the army as a whole is quite competitive, even the mortal side, though the demon side is definitely one of the very top armies within the game. So if you're looking for a competitive army that can go together really quickly and not too worried about cost, this could be a really great army to get into Warhammer Age of Sigmar with for you. Next up, the Hedonites of Slaanesh. Now, this army does have a star collecting box, which is the demons. However, it requires a little bit more. This does give you some great summoning units for the army, but it does require you purchasing maybe a couple of these to really get the best out of it. So it's not the worst one. It is one of the cheapest star collecting boxes as well, so it's got that going for it. Also, at the current point in time, there is a Battle Force box going out. We've got a video for starting a Slaanesh army with that box. That can be a great way to get into the mortal half of the army. Model count for this army, while initially you won't have many models on the table, it is a more elite army at the start of the game. It does have a very high summoning mechanic, so you will need a lot more models to summon throughout the course of the game. Cost of the army can vary. There are some really expensive kits within the army, but the demon half is generally quite cheap. So while you might be spending more money getting your initial army on the table, your summoning does come around a little bit cheaper than most other ranges. Painting skill for the army is a bit of a mixed bag as well. Like many of the demon mortal half army, the demons do go together pretty quickly, though some of the more elite demon options definitely have more techniques to learn to paint them, as they've got more bits and pieces going on with the models. The mortal half of the army does have a lot of detail though. You've definitely got trim, you've got armor, you've got hair, you've got furs, all over different parts, and some of the centerpieces of the army are truly amazing pieces, but will require a lot of effort to paint. This leads us into the ways of play. The army really has one competitive build, and that is trying to get as much summoning on the table by doing as many depravity. This, of course, once again, just leads us back to the fact that summoning is going to raise our cost of the army because we're going to have to be buying more things to summon and get us different options on the tabletop. So there's definitely that going for the game. Ease of play is certainly not something with Slaanesh, as it is one of those armies that plays a very different game of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Relying on its summoning, it has really fragile units that are really expensive, so if you are not careful, you'll find yourself taken off the table really quickly, with not much fight by an army or by parts of your opponent's army worth much less than your army's whole. The last thing to talk about with Slaanesh is definitely competitiveness. The army certainly is not in a good place competitively at the moment, and does really struggle. While skilled players definitely can do really well with the army, it really does struggle at the higher end of the game to match it with other armies of a higher competitive level. So this is definitely probably Slaanesh's single biggest weakness of anything, in that it is one of the two weakest armies in the game currently. Next, the Maggotkin of Nurgle, the newest battle tome on the block. Maggotkin of Nurgle is a pretty good army to get started with in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, for a couple of different reasons. First of all, it no longer has a start collecting box, it has what's called a Vanguard box, which actually these Vanguard boxes, while a little bit more expensive than the start collecting box, actually get you more models at a good discount, so they're a great way to get started with a brand new army for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. This is really cool as well because it gives you both parts of the army. You'll get enough models to run an army, and you'll also get enough demons to give you some summoning options in that Vanguard box. It's a fantastic little star set. Two of them will give you a ton of models and give you a really decent sized force. Model count for the army is relatively low. The only unit that really increases your model size for the army is Plague Bearers, and even then you're not going to be taking much more than 40 or 50 at max in an army, even in an all Plague Bearer force. This, of course, lowers the cost of the army. While your kits may be around that $90 Australian mark, some of the more expensive kits in the game for baseline infantry, you are not having to buy very many of them. Model count armies with things like Putrid Black Kings and Pusgover Black Lords really are quite elite and low model count armies, so you're not going to have many models on the table. This, of course, is backed up, I guess, and counterpointed by the fact the army does summon, though the summoning for this army is definitely not as over amounted like some other forces, so you're not having to summon whole units a turn. You're more likely summoning, 2 or 3 units for the whole game. So you've got the options around to play with how you want to build this list. Definitely you can build into summoning if you want to, and there are ways you can definitely increase the ability to summon stuff to the table, but it is not an army that has an over-reliance on it like some of the other Chaos factions do. Painting skill for the army is probably one of the easier main Chaos factions to paint, in the fact that the demons are easy and the Black Kings and all the mortal half of the army do go together really easy. You can use a lot of nice sort of dirty techniques to really dirty up your model, and honestly it's one of those armies where if you spill a bit of wash over onto the other colour, it doesn't really matter. It's an army where you maybe sometimes get rewarded for sloppy mistakes, though you're obviously not trying to. You do have the parts of this army that do look good, where you've got bruising and all that sort of stuff across the flesh, which you can use with nice wash techniques. So even the more advanced techniques of the army, painting-wise, can be achieved with relatively simple things. So, painting like bruising and all that on the skin, while you think it might be hard, can be quite easy with some really basic sort of stuff from GW, things like washes and stuff like that. We've then got, I guess, the multiple ways to play, which the army does do. You can definitely build into summoning, you can build into having a tree garden sprout around the table. You've got your more mortal elite army, and you can definitely run more big bad guys. This army does have a couple of ways to play. While not a massive spread of ways to play, there are a few which makes for an interesting army. Ease of play with Maggotkin is probably somewhat middling. While the initial army doesn't have a lot of special rules on most of its war scrolls, there are a couple of Allegiance abilities that really do require a little bit of uptick. I'd really recommend finding a way to count your contagion points and count those disease points on units, and then definitely finding a way to keep track of summoning, and also your wheel is the other thing. You can find some amazing versions of the wheel, print out a piece of paper and put a little spinny thing on it to make something for your wheel, but you've got a few allegiance abilities that require a little bit of upkeep. So this can make the army harder to learn, but the units themselves don't have an awful lot of extra rules on them to muddle the waters. Competitiveness, the army, it definitely is a little bit early to be saying, but the army looks solid, if not the most top tier army in the game. Disease is definitely something a lot of people are underrating, I think, and some of the units are definitely a lot stronger than most people think. It's definitely a good, solid, high middle tier army without a doubt. Next up, we have the Skaven. So, Skaven do have a slight collecting box that does focus on one of the particular clans within Skaven, being Clan Pestilence. However, a couple of kits within that box, the Plague Furnace, which can also be built as a Screaming Belt, and the Plague Claw Catapult, which can also be built as a Warp Lightning Cannon, are dual kits. So you do have the option to build a couple of different units out of that box set, though your core will be Plague Monks. This means if you choose to build those other options, in particular the Warp Lightning Cannon, they will break your Clan Pestilence allegiance in the army, meaning you have to purchase some Clan Rats. Now, this in itself is its own issue. The army model count can be extremely high. As soon as you start going into Clan Rats, you need at least 60 models or 30 Storm Vermin. So you're having to sort of play around with, at minimum, 30 or 60, depending on what you go with for these models. Certainly, the more competitive is definitely purchasing those Clan Rats, taking you up to 60 models minimum. This, of course, isn't the biggest issue with cost of the army, though, because they are older kits. They're generally not as expensive as some of the new ones. Some of the more elite units and more recent kits, like the Storm Fiends, are definitely more expensive, and there are some issues with some of the Finecast and metal kits not coming in certain unit sizes. Things like the Scryer Acolytes can be extremely expensive to buy, but the vast majority of the army can be relatively bought at a cheap price. Skaven do not have any summoning. They have maybe some rules with particular subfactions that can bring units back, and the potential of maybe bringing a Verminlord, but having a spare Verminlord is not that terrible when you consider some of the summoning of other armies. Your painting skills with Skaven, they do have quite a lot of detail on some of the models, though with dry brushing and washing and contrast, they come together really, really quickly. You've got some really easy to paint techniques that let you paint hordes of rats at a relatively easy time. However, they are hordes of rats you're painting, so you can generally find you're going to be painting a lot of miniatures. While you might not have the most complex miniatures in the game, you will definitely have a lot of them to paint in many builds of this type of army. The army does have multiple ways to play. The clans allow you to freely mix, but also allow you to divert into playing pure clan lists. So you've got plenty of different ways to play with the army. Ease of play is maybe an issue with Skaven, as the army building techniques of Skaven can be a little bit confusing on how it works, and maybe we'll do a whole video talking about that, because it is one of the most interesting versions of building an army and playing in, I guess, particular subfactions in the game. But it generally does have pretty easy rules. You take a Scryer unit, you get Scryer abilities. You take a Molder hero, you get Molder abilities. It's a pretty cool little system for them. In all honesty, it maybe just can be a little bit hard to understand. Competitiveness, Skaven fall in that sort of middle ground. They're an army that's always got answers. They've got a very wide range of models, so you can generally find a list of Skaven that is competitive in some way, just due to the amount of models you have in the army. It just may not be the models you have, because there is such a wide pool of models throughout the army. So all in all, Skaven are a pretty middling sort of army to start with. You've definitely got some pros and some cons for them, so a very middling sort of the road army to start with for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. And lastly, for Chaos, we have the Slaves to Darkness. So, Slaves to Darkness do have a Star Collecting Box, and it does give you a good variety of models, and including one of the models you can only pick up in that Star Collecting Box is the Chaos Lord on Karkadrak, who is an absolute monster on the tabletop. So, the Star Collecting Box is a really great way to get into a Slaves to Darkness force, and a cheap way as well. The army does have some issues with getting into the army and the cost of some of the units. Things like Vanguard can be really expensive, and some of your more elite units do cost maybe a little bit, but model count for the army, you are not going to be playing a horde. Even if you go all Chaos Warriors, you're probably not going to breach that sort of 60 model limit, which is pretty good. So even the more horde styles of the army aren't going to be too high. You do have some issues maybe with Marauder style armies, with heavy Marauder armies definitely bringing a lot more models to the table, but those models are sort of counteracted by some really easy painting schemes on the army. The army does come together really well with painting. This is a big reason because you've got large flat areas of either armor or skin which can take either contrast or dry brushing techniques really well. There are some more detailed kits like the Vanguard within the army, and certainly Archaon the Everchosen himself has a lot of issues with painting because he has so many different techniques required to paint that model, and he is such a massive project to undertake, but the army does generally come together quite well. The army has very minimal summoning. In particular, sub-factions you can summon on some of the cultist units, so this does require you to have a few extra models, but definitely nothing too egregious for your summoning. The army has a lot of ways to play and is honestly one of the better armies built in that it steers you down certain sub-factions wanting you to play in various different ways. You can use the same models in many of these armies, but different versions of this require you to maybe have different amounts of different types of units. I said different there a lot. But this is really cool. It allows you to play in lots of different ways. I said different again. Which is just a great way for the army to be built. This is really fun army, and the ease of play of the army is honestly pretty easy. All these builds allow you to very clearly see what you're trying to do with these particular forces, so it makes easy of play really easy. And I guess the last thing to talk about with them is the fact that they are decently competitive. Slaves to Darkness are sort of sitting in that middle ground. There's definitely some builds of them that can work really well, and the great thing about Slaves to Darkness too is how they sort of build into a lot of other armies. We talked about multiple ways to play, but you could actually play your Slaves to Darkness army as a Disciples of Tzeentch army, or as a Blades of Khorne army, or as a Hedonites of Slaanesh army, based on some units, adding in some units from those other factions. And Chaos in general has this as a whole, where a lot of the armies do sort of mix and match. You've got a lot of coalition rules throughout the entire army, which really makes Chaos a great Grand Alliance to get into as an army, because you can play around with mixing and matching different units from all these different forces we've talked about today. With that said, Slaves to Darkness are a great army. Honestly, in my best video, they were probably my number 6 army, almost getting in my top 5 for best and worst, and so a great place to start for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Well, that's the end of the video. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And while you're at it, drop us a comment below in the comment section and let us know what you enjoyed about the video. If you'd like to come chat more with me and other members of our fine little community here at Sinful Gaming, you can do so by following the link in the video's description to our Discord server. Lastly, we'd like to give a shout out to everyone who supports the channel via Patreon and YouTube members, and you can go help support the channel via Patreon and YouTube members as well and get access to, if you're a YouTube member, some of our awesome little gifts, or get choice of what we're going to do for content on the channel. You can follow those links in the description of the video to Patreon and YouTube members, but a shout out to them all, our Patreons: Christian Weir, James Soren, Greenskins Gaming, AJC, Kenny Lowell, Outer and Shot First, Andrew Bowen, Nathan Fee, The Rising Ape, Cure Dynamic, Agu, Anthony B, Anton Nilsson, JJ Austrian, Average Wargamer, Domir, Mark Harvey, and James Cater. And to our YouTube members as well, a special shout out to Green Roots Gaming, Kenton Young, Chris Wallace, Aronya, Vinny, Lockloric, The Johnny84, David Ellsworth, Revenar, Wolfric Nick, and Broken Chef. Lastly, I'd like to give a special shout out first of all to Lady Witchvox Art, who does all the amazing artwork for the channel that you see here, and to Xmorphic, who does all the amazing work and the background work for our Discord server. Thank you both very much for all your help. That's it for today though, everyone. Stay safe, stay well, and most of all, keep fighting that war against the Grey. Ciao for now.